and welcome to the Baptist Pulpit, a ministry of the Friendship Baptist Church in Trenton, Georgia. In this video, my father, Bill Goins, is teaching on why we use the King James Bible, a history of the King James Version. Hope it'll be a blessing and encouragement to your heart.
Good morning, everybody. I brought a songbook up in my hand. I was trying to figure out how to turn this thing on without holding it. All right. If anybody would like, I have some copies of my notes up here, as well as some pages of some scriptures that show a clear line between the Tyndale Bible and the King James Bible. Brother, if maybe somebody can pass those out to anybody that wants them. And now keep in mind, these notes are just that. They're just quickly typed in. I guarantee you there are spelling errors, but I do that almost in the same context as William Tyndale and some of the others early Bible translators. They never had the same spelling. As a matter of fact, if you go back in history, you'll see that spelling was not concreted until after the dictionary was done in 1828. And so William Shakespeare, get this, there are 12 known signatures in museums of William Shakespeare, and not one of them are spelled the same. So he didn't even spell his name the same. So it's okay if I have misspellings in here, because we're looking at the history this morning anyway. Up here, I've got a book here. It's called An Understandable History of the Bible by Sam Gipp. And I brought this just to show you we're not going to be able to cover everything this morning. This is how big this is a condensed version of the history of the Bible. Okay, so we can't cover everything. Also, there's a facsimile of a King James up here from the 400th anniversary. There are some actual pages of a Geneva Bibles, as well as a 1612 printing of King James, as well as a 1756, and I can't remember which one the other one is right off the top of the head. But then there's also a Tyndale New Testament, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. On the notes there, you'll see at the top, leadership change, religious change, and language change. Now, when looking at the history of the English translation, you'll notice that in a short period of time, really in a very short period of time, there were three primary things that God used to get us our English translation, and these things were changes that all came about all at the same time. I mean, think about this. You've got more than 1,000 years, 1,200 to 1,300 years of Latin Vulgate, Catholic distributed scriptures, and people didn't understand it. People didn't understand. They would go to church, and they would sit under the Latin Vulgate teachings and preachings, and they would even recite passages when the priests would tell them to, and they didn't even know what they were saying. And primarily, people in that day, throughout those dark ages of Catholic rule, they didn't know anything about the Scriptures, and they didn't even know how to read. Even if they had a copy of the Scriptures, they wouldn't have been able to read it, most likely. And anything that was any Scriptures, any Bibles that were produced were done by hand, and so they were very expensive. There were very few of them in regards to that. So let's just look back a little bit at some of that far history. And you got in 382, a man named Jerome. He was a Catholic. The beginnings really of the Catholic Church. One of the bishops there. He translated the Greek and Hebrew into what's known as the Latin Vulgate. Okay. Now the word Vulgate comes from the word vulgar, and really just means common. Okay, it just means common, because in that day the Greek was beginning to pass off the scene. The Jews were cast out of Israel in 70 AD, and so the Hebrew language wasn't commonly known, and so they translated the language in the Bible into the Latin, which was a more commonly known language. But here's what happened, and we need to be careful. Okay, we really do. We need to be careful that we don't take this same attitude with the English Bible, because the Catholics began to look at the Latin translation, that Latin Vulgate, as God's Word, and only that as God's Word. Okay. In other words, they did not encourage anybody to study the Hebrew and the Greek. They certainly didn't encourage. In fact, upon pain of death, discouraged anybody trying to translate the scriptures into any other language. Okay, and so it was so they considered that Latin Vulgate as the Bible, as the Word of God. And now, like I said, we could be, if we're not careful, the same way about English. I don't believe that we should. I think it's fine to have the scriptures translated into other languages.
Yes.
I think that's important.
Yes.
I think everybody needs to be able to read the scriptures, and so we need to be careful of that. There are some people who lean that way. But then in 1382, now you see there, that's 1,000 years of Latin, 1,000 years of Latin-only scriptures and controlled by the Catholic Church. Okay, but John Wycliffe. And now John Wycliffe is not the first English translation. Okay, there are evidences of other English translations prior to this, but this is the first real try to translate the scriptures. In times past, you have people who translated some of the Psalms into English or very early Old English, and they would sing them, you know, and those were even outlawed by the Catholic Church, but you know they didn't write them down and publish them and spread them and stuff like that like John Wycliffe did. But now John Wycliffe, he is called the Morning Star of the Reformation because his influence, his inspiration of what he did, and his martyrdom, well, not really martyrdom, I'm sorry, I'll get back to that, but the attitude the Catholic Church had about him was one of the things that inspired the Reformation later on. Okay, and there was a trickling effect of his influence all the way up until the Reformation began. So he was hunted by the Catholic Church and had to run. Okay, he had to flee for his life. He had to travel all over the place. And there was a group of people that became his disciples or his followers, and they call them the Lollards. The word Lollard just simply means mumbler, and probably because they went about meditating on the scriptures and quoting the scriptures all the time, and so that's the reason they were called the Lollards. But he was hunted, but they didn't ever catch him until he died of sickness. He got sick and died, and was buried. But he died after he died in 1415. This was like 60 or 70 years later. About 40 years later after he died. The Council of Constance was held by the Catholic Church, in which at that time they named him a heretic, and as a result they went and found where he was buried, dug up his remains, tied him to a stake and burned him, and then cast his ashes into a river called Swift. Okay, so they went to the extreme for this reason. Now you think, well, why in the world would they do that? It doesn't matter, he's already dead. Well, we see it that way, of course. But here's their reasoning. Look, we don't want these Lollard people. After Wycliffe died, they've continued to copy. They've continued to copy his scriptures. They've handwritten copies, and these copies are showing up all over the place. And we need to make sure that this doesn't get out. And we got to stop this, nip it in the bud, so to speak. And so they went and dug this up and made a public display. Look, this is what's going to happen to you if you're caught with these Bibles. This is what's going to happen to you if you're caught copying these things. This is how we feel about this. And so the Lollard people, but the Lollard people continued to copy those scriptures for decades and decades and decades. At one point, 60 people within one Lollard village was arrested, 2 of which were murdered, killed, burned at the stake as heretics. And the rest of them were kept in prison until about half of them died in prison. Okay, and when I say prison, I'm not talking about the kind of prisons we have today. You know, this was a dark dungeon place. Okay, with no light and very little bit of food, and what there was diseased food. So they intended for you to die in prison. But then you'll notice that just about 2 decades later, just a short time later, in 1440, the Gutenberg press. The Gutenberg press was invented. Now there were other kinds of things where people tried to use things for printing presses and things like that. There were other attempts before the Gutenberg, and in China they were doing screen printing and stuff. And so, but Gutenberg is a big deal, because the first thing he did when he invented the printing press was he printed a copy of the Latin Vulgate. Now, the Catholic Church was happy about this, but what it showed was that now this was a game changer. Back in the late 80s and early 90s when the internet started taking off, that was a game changer. Information now is readily available to anybody that needs information. And here's the thing, remember, not many people could read. Well, one of the reasons they couldn't read is they didn't have anything to read, right? But now, all of a sudden, instead of taking years for somebody to sit down and hand copy a page of Scripture in a book, you've got somebody that can make multiple copies, one after the other, by pressing those pages onto that movable type, and then changing the plates and doing the next page and changing the plates and doing. It was an arduous task still, but it was nowhere near as arduous as handwriting those copies, and it was also meant that all the copies that were printed at that printing would be the same. Even if there were some errors in it, the errors would be consistent, right?
Yes.
But that meant that whenever Wycliffe translated his scriptures, you can still find they copied so many of them. There were a lot of them. But because they were hand copying them, there was a lot of different errors, different mistakes. The page, there's no page numbers on his scriptures because whenever they would copy it, they'd run out of paper on this page, and they continued. So every book had different pages, different scriptures on different pages, and so it wasn't something that you could read and together and stuff like that, because you wouldn't know how to find the scripture. There were no verses or chapter markings. And so it was difficult to find your place. But the Gutenberg press changed a lot of that. And all of a sudden, God had made available a piece of technology that made information flow more freely. Now, as a result, Erasmus there was another printer after Gutenberg that took the original Greek New Testament scriptures that he could find, and he had printed those. Okay. Well, Erasmus got a hold of some of that, and it wasn't the whole New Testament, but Erasmus got a hold of some of that and realized, hey, these things that the Catholic Church is teaching is not in here. Mm-hmm. There's differences from what the Catholic Church is teaching as to what and a lot of people saw that because these things were printed and spread about. So Erasmus went and he found all of the known handwritten copies of the Greek that he could find and compiled them together and created what is now known as the Textus Receptus. They wasn't called that then, but he created that Textus Receptus, and in 1512 he took all those manuscripts, put them together, and he had those printed and spread out. Now Erasmus was a Catholic teacher. He was a Catholic. I don't think he was a monk, but he was a Catholic teacher. He's a very, 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 very intelligent man. All of the countries that were in Europe sought for Erasmus to come and live within their borders because how smart he was and how popular he was. So the Pope really couldn't do anything about it. He tried, but he couldn't. I mean, they actually went and gathered as many of those copies up as they could. Get this, the Pope don't want the Greek out there. They only want the Latin. They don't want people looking at the Greek, because if they look at the Greek, they're going to see that the Catholic Church is not teaching the correct things.
Yes.
Okay, so he goes out and he tries to destroy them. But in the midst of all of that, guess who else got a hold of one of those copies of the Greek New Testament? A man named Martin Luther in 1517. He got a hold of one of those copies of the Greek New Testament, and now having read it, he realized that the Catholic Church was wrong about this and about that. Notice it's because of translation that we had the error, and he was going back to those originals. Okay, now he's looking at and printing also was one of the huge reasons why he was able to get a hold of this. But he looked at that and realized, and that's when he created his 95 Theses and put them on the door of the church there in Germany. And it spurred the Reformation. It started the Reformation. It is said that Erasmus hatched the egg that Martin Luther, or laid the egg rather, that Martin Luther hatched as far as the Reformation is concerned. Had Erasmus not done what he did, Martin Luther may not have done what he did, which was what started that idea among the people that, you know what, all of these things that I have been taught and I've followed obediently for years and years and years, all my life, my grandparents did, my great-grandparents and their great-grandparents and so forth, those things are not all right. Okay. We can see for ourselves that those things are not all right. Now now we come into a leadership change. Okay. Now the monarchy in England was really controlled by the Catholic Church, and that's just the way things were. Yeah. Not just the monarchy in England, monarchy in Spain, in France, and other European areas. The Pope was in control because you can't control the people by telling them, unless you tell them that their souls are either condemned or because of what they're doing, or they're going to be saved because of what they're doing. And it was a works-based salvation. But Henry VIII came into power in 1509. He was the king until 1547. Now this is all his leadership takes place during the Reformation, right? All of this is happening at the same time. The printing press gets invented. These leadership changes. Now Henry VIII, he was a very different kind of king. He was very intelligent. We speak badly of him, but he was real smart. But the thing about Henry VIII was he wanted a male heir very badly. He was the last of the Tudor line, okay, and he wanted to make sure that the Tudor line stayed in power. So he needed a male heir. Well, here's what happened. His first wife wasn't able to give him a male heir, so he desperately wanted a divorce, and so he wanted that divorce, but the Pope wouldn't grant it to him. And because the Pope wouldn't grant him the divorce, he decided after some time that he was just going to kick the Catholic Pope out, and he was going to be in control of his own church, named it the Church of England. And so the Catholic Church was basically dissolved within England. We're going to a little more of that in here in just a minute. But now, around the same time that Henry VIII, during his reign, there were 7 main English translations. Again, there were earlier ones than that, but there are 7 main ones. 4 of these happened during Henry VIII's reign, and that shows you just how quick this all took place. It wasn't over long distances. Thousands of years has passed and no change. Okay, well, 1,300 years have passed without any change. It's all Latin Vulgate. But now all of a sudden you get change after change after change, multiple versions. You have a German translation, you have an English translation, there becomes a Spanish translation. I mean, people are translating the Word of God all over the place. But in 1523, William Tyndale starts working on a new translation. He is spurred to do this because of what's going on in Germany. He sees Martin Luther and how that there's such a change in how the Catholic Church is wrong about the things. Now, William Tyndale, he could speak German. He was fluent in German. He was fluent in Spanish and French and Hebrew and Latin and Greek and a couple of others that I don't remember right now. 8 or 9 different languages he was fluent in. Tremendously intelligent man. Okay, and he went to school at Oxford, if I recall. But he went to his bishop. He wanted to do in England what Martin Luther had done in Germany, and so he went to his bishop and he begged his bishop to get clearance from the church to allow him to. Now at this time the Catholic Church was still in charge, to allow him to translate the scriptures into English. Okay. Well, this bishop, he kind of just put him off. He said, well, that's a good idea. We'll see what we can do. But then when time would pass and nothing happened, and he'd come to him again and over again. But finally he realized he was not going to get church authorization to do this, so he decided to do it on his own, even though he knew that meant he was going to be, potentially arrested and tried as a heretic. So he ran. He left England. He went into the other European nations, and we don't know exactly where all he went. He went here and there and there and here. He moved around a lot because they wanted him dead, because they found out what he was doing. Okay, but he began translating the scriptures, and not only would he translate it, he would find printers to print it for him. This is a William Tyndale New Testament, and one of the interesting things about this is that when he translated it, when he had these printed, it was about this size. This is an accurate size of the Tyndale Bible. Now, this comes at a time when most Bibles that had ever been produced, handwritten Bibles and printed Bibles, were 11 by 17. They were big. Okay, they were large books. Okay, so why did he have it? Why did he do it so small? Because he was a smuggler of the Word of God. And literally, what he would do is he would have these things printed. He wouldn't have them bound right away. He would take the pages and interlace the pages of other books with his pages of the New Testament and smuggle them into England. And that was how he got those Bibles into England. And then on the other side, somebody would get those books that were not against the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church said those books are fine, so they let them come in, no problem. Then somebody would get those books, go through and pull out all the pages and recompile them in the right order and bind them and sell them to whoever could afford to get them. They were still expensive, but because he had to pay the printers to do it. Okay, but that was how he got these in. But there was another unexpected thing that happened, and that is this: when people who owned these Bibles could carry one around with them in their pocket or in a satchel, it became not only could they now read the Bible in their language, but it was something that they could carry with them anywhere.
Yes.
And they could pull it out any time and read it. I mean, if you'd had the normal 11 to 17 books, you'd have to hide it in your house somewhere, and while you were at work out on the field or something like that, if you had a hankering to read God's Word, you couldn't do it because it was at the house. This way, they could carry it around. It became something. See, for that 1,000+ years, the Bible was a church thing. It was only in the church. It was only when you went to church that you heard the scriptures read or even tried to recite it, and you didn't understand it. It was not a personal thing. This made the Bible a personal thing. That was another big deal for the Reformation, because now not only is the Bible, so if the Bible is a personal thing, then it's not. I don't have to have the church in between me and God. I've got access to Him myself.
Amen.
See,
Yeah,
and so that was a big deal. And y'all can feel free to take a look at that if you want. One of the interesting things about that is the spelling is really wacky. You will see that if you look at it. But some of the things that the Catholic Church was really, really against, as far as he was concerned, was some of the translated words that he translated and changed. 4 of them were the most notable ones. He changed the word church to congregation. Now we use the word church today, right? No problem. But think about the word church from their point of view. The church was in charge. The church was the one that was between them and God. The church. And so when you changed the word from church to congregation, you were saying it's not the church, the Catholic Church. It's the local group of people who are coming together. Right?
Amen.
Well, we know the word church means that. And it's not a problem for us today, but in their day, that was a big deal.
Yes.
Okay? And the word priest, they changed to elder. He changed to elder because he didn't want people thinking they had to go to the priest, the Catholic priest. In the Latin translation, the Latin word for the word repent that we use today was do penance. Do penance. What's penance to the Catholic Church? To the Catholic Church, the penance is the things you have to do in order to get absolved from your sins.
Right.
Okay. So you're doing something, right? Where Tyndale, having read the New Testament fresh and realized that wasn't right, he translated the word repent. So that becomes an inner thing. It's something that we do still, really, but it's something we do inside, not a physical work that we can do in order to gain our salvation. He changed the word charity to love. Now, the word charity has the undertones of doing something in order to get. So he changed the word charity to love. And so the Catholic Church hated these changes. And anytime they got an opportunity, they would burn these things when they got hold of them. Okay, that's why there's not all that many of them left. But one of the things that Tyndale said just before he started the translation work, he was talking with a Catholic scholar at dinner one day, and the scholar said this. And now here's the mindset of most of the Catholic leaders. Okay, he said this: "We were better be without God's laws than the Pope's." So what he was saying is, rather than read the Bible, we need to look at what the Pope says. right? And now what was he basing that on? He wasn't basing it on Scripture.
No, sir.
He was basing it on what the Pope said, right? So, but then Tyndale's response to that was this, and this is what spurred his work. I defy the Pope and all his laws. If God spare my life ere many years, I will cause a boy that driveth the plow shall know more of the Scriptures than thou dost.
Amen.
He was a bold preacher.
Yes.
Now, to be honest, I like that, but he could have been a little bit more tactful, and maybe he wouldn't have gotten arrested so quickly. But but I'm gonna leave that up to him, between him and God. Now, there's also a language change that's going on during this time, and in large part, it's due to the printing press. Because see, you had just like today in America, we have different dialects. You have Southern slang. You have this talk over here and that talk over here and that talk over. Well, imagine if nobody was ever watching TV or listening to radios or reading newspapers, and the only language that you ever got was in your local area.
Yes.
And by speak, because you didn't read, right? So the language was really different. No matter where you went, you was getting different language, different forms of the English. Okay, and well, when the printing press came out, it started becoming more centralized and more firm, a little bit more firm as to what words mean and so forth. Just because of having the ability to read, not just the Bible, but other books. But then also this change from this from the Latin Vulgate to Greek was a huge thing too. William Tyndale is also responsible for new English words that we use today. The Greek word baptismo, the definition of that is to immerse, right? But he instead of translating that to immerse, and so it would fit within the context, he created a new word, baptism. Okay, baptism. Now, one of the reasons I think why he did that was because was just simply because if you're reading the passage and you get to he baptized this, that would mean you'd have to say he immersed. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're doing it for what reason you're doing it for. And so he basically coined that phrase. He also coined the phrase Passover. Passover is a word that talks about how whenever during the Egyptian rule, and they were getting ready to leave Egypt, the Spirit passed over those who had the blood on the doorpost, right? Well, the Hebrew word for that was pasha, or something to that extent. I don't remember exactly how it's pronounced, obviously, but that Hebrew word didn't really describe in English translation what was going on, so he coined the phrase Passover. So, and if I'm not mistaken, brother, you can tell me later, even Jewish people who speak English speak of the Passover. Okay? Well, that isn't even really their history in some respects, because that word was coined by a Reformed Christian, right? So I mean that's interesting. But Henry VIII was very much against Tyndale. He didn't like him. He was out to try to get him and arrest him and put him, because at the first part of Tyndale, the Catholic Church was still in charge of England. Okay. But he couldn't find him. He sought after him. He had his agents out looking for him, trying to arrest him. And he actually wanted him, after he was arrested, he wanted them to bring him to him. Because at one point, Henry VIII contacted or sent messenger to Tyndale and said, look, if you'll come in, then I'll make you a part of my court, and we'll try to come to a kind of compromise. Well, Tyndale's response was, unless you let me do this work, I'm not coming. So he just blatantly, and that angered Henry VIII. I mean, he's the king of England, and you're gonna talk back to me, I'll have none of it. And he sent people to arrest him. So Tyndale was arrested, and finally brought to the king. Here's how it happened. Now this is interesting. Okay, Tyndale, a friend of his, or an acquaintance really, named Henry Phillips, wicked man. Okay. Henry Phillips asked him to come to dinner, but it was a trap. He had betrayed Tyndale. So he came to dinner, and he got arrested at that location. Now think about this. Here you have William Tyndale. First of all, in his translation, let's point this out. I just thought so. In his translation, in John 1, now remember, this is one of the first English translations. He said, in the beginning was the Word. Right? So he used the word to describe Jesus. Okay? So the word is used to describe Jesus, and Jesus, of course, came and died for us.
Yes.
Sure.
Including William Tyndale.
Yes.
So the Word died for William Tyndale. Guess what? William Tyndale died for the Word.
Amen.
Now keep that in mind when listening, thinking about this. You have a dinner or supper where Tyndale is there, and a so-called friend betrays him,
Yes.
and he's arrested and taken to his death.
Yes.
I like it. I like it.
Yeah.
There's some similarities there. Tyndale is a great historian. We owe a lot to him. Okay. Now after he was arrested, he was kept in a dungeon for a long period of time, over a year, kept in a dark dungeon. We know this because he actually sent word and begged for somebody to bring him candles because he was in the darkness for over a year. He was in darkness. Okay. Well, then whenever they finally decided to, and get this, when he was in that dungeon, they came to him, and every day they would come to him and try to get him to recant. For over a year, every day, they would come to him and try to show him from their Latin scriptures why he was wrong. Okay? Now, they weren't trying to do that to get him to recant so they could let him go.
No.
He was going to go to death.
Yes.
That's final. He was on death row. Okay? They were trying to save his soul, is what they thought. Okay? But here's what he did. He stuck through all of that. But not only that, in 1536, he was tied to a stake. They wrapped a rope around he was tied to a stake that was prepared to burn him. They tied a rope around his neck, around the back part of the stake, tied the rope to another stick, and they turned that stick until it strangled him. They thought they had strangled him to death. So they let go and they lit the fire. But then he hadn't died. He woke up. He regained consciousness just before the flames, started burning him real bad. And his last words were, "Lord, open the eyes of the King of England." Now, who was the King of England? Henry VIII, right? So he was asking God to open Henry VIII's eyes. Okay, wasn't long after that the whole thing happened where he wanted to marry. He wanted to get a divorce from Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn, and he divorced basically the Catholic Church.
Yes.
Okay, that was the first step in his eyes being opened.
Yes.
Okay, I don't think he was really a good man or anything like that. Don't get me wrong, but God used him
Sure.
to change things.
Sure.
Now, so there you have a religious change. See, these leadership changes, languages changes, these religious changes all lead up to the English translation being widely used. So Henry VIII kicked Catholicism out. Marries Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn has a daughter named Elizabeth. Okay, but his first wife, Catherine, had a daughter named Mary. Now Mary was raised in Spain, highly Catholic. Elizabeth was raised in Scotland, highly Protestant, or we'd say Church of England. Okay, so he kicked those people out. Kicked the church out. Now, after he kicked the church out, what did he do? I mean, you have cathedrals and massive amounts of money that was spent. The church was rich. I mean, overflowing with richness. I mean, they had tons and tons. I mean, they silver platters to get your wafers off of. You know what I'm saying? They were rich while the other people were poor. What did the king do with that money? What did he do with all that money? He seized the lands and gave those properties to his friends, people, and they became lords. That's where we get the term landlords. Okay, they became lords of that land. It still was owned by the king or by the monarchy, but they lorded over it and controlled it for him and ran it for him. And so you have that happen, and then the money that was generated at those lands, he put into the military, because at that time England had 2 ships for their navy. 2. Spain was the world power at the time. They had over 100 ships. By the end of Henry VIII's reign, he had increased the Navy to 84 ships. Okay? So you're going to have a war going on a little bit later on that also is part of all this coming together. Okay? And Elizabeth in English, what we call Elizabeth in English, didn't start really with Elizabeth. It began changing. Remember, the English language is coming together, and it's actually getting more and more precise. Today, we know the English language, when you say cool, it means 4 or 5 different things, right? The English language is no longer anywhere near as precise as it was in this day, and it was getting more and more precise. Linguistics people, even those who don't agree with any of our positions, will tell you that what happened right after the Elizabethan English was the language's most precise form. Okay, that's where the King James Bible was translated during that time. Okay, now you've got the Geneva Bible in. I'm sorry, I've skipped ahead. I'm supposed to be on this page. Miles Coverdale, 1536. Now, Miles Coverdale was Tyndale's assistant, one of Tyndale's assistants. And so he did a Bible that's mostly Tyndale's New Testament, and Genesis. Tyndale also did Genesis through the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and then he actually also had done some translation work on some other things. But after he was arrested, all of his stuff was burned, and it was believed that a lot of his notes was destroyed, where some of them were actually. We'll see that in a minute. Henry VIII remarried, and because he remarried, his wife, Anne Boleyn, she was highly Protestant, and she was actually in favor of English translations. Wow! So this whole thing with divorcing the king, divorcing and bringing in the Church of England, and now all of a sudden his new wife is positive toward English translation. In fact, owned a Coverdale Bible. Okay. So she has the king's ear, and all of a sudden, after Tyndale's dead, now almost within 10 months, within 10 months of Tyndale's death, Henry VIII will the Matthew's Bible. Henry VIII will approve it within 10 months. That was a prayer answered. There was a lot more here, but I'm going to skip some of that. You can look over that a little bit later. But mostly, the Miles Coverdale's Bible was a Tyndale work, as well as translating Luther's German Old Testament into English. Okay, so that's not a great translation, right? It needs to be from the Hebrew.
Yes.
Okay, but it was the best thing he had at the time. It was the best thing he could do. He didn't know Hebrew. Okay, and keep in mind, this is one man doing the work, yes, not a committee. Okay, and then you have the Matthew's Bible, 1537. This was John Rogers. He didn't put his name on it. Why? Well, he was one of Tyndale's assistants too, and he saw just 10 months earlier, he saw his benefactor, his leader, get burned at the stake, yes, and strangled. And saw the whole thing that happened. He didn't want to be the second one, to have to go through that. So he changed. He put the name Thomas Matthews in there as a pseudonym. He didn't give his real name. Also, it was interesting though. Between the Old and New Testaments was a page that had a giant, big letters with real ornate, fancy letters. WT. Stood for William Tyndale. So what he was saying is, my pseudonym is Thomas Matthews. I'm really John Rogers, but the truth of the matter is, this New Testament you're about to read is all William Tyndale. Yes. That's what he was saying. Okay, and everybody in the land knew it. Okay, after they'd seen it and everything, obviously. So then you have in 1539 the Great Bible. This book was actually a work that was not only did Henry VIII approve. He approved the work of the Matthew's Bible, but after it got started, he realized that there started being there was still a lot of people in the Church of England that were Catholic minded. Okay, And they would still even read from Latin. Well, now all of a sudden this Matthew's Bible is out there in droves. I mean, printing press. And it was approved by the king, so there's hundreds and hundreds of copies floating around. And literally, this is what would happen. You would have the priest in the middle of a church service reading from Latin, and people in the congregation reading over him in the English. And it caused a big, big stir. Out of this movement, you get the Puritans start coming into play, okay? Because they start seeing the Latin is no good. We need to use the English. We need to stick with what the truth is, and they start focusing on that. Well, you've got some controversy there. And so King James didn't like that. He didn't like King James, Henry VIII didn't like that. So Henry VIII, actually in 1539, did what's called the Great Bible. Now the Great Bible is called that because it was big. It was the 1117 sheets, okay? And it was literally chained to the pulpit, okay? And now keep in mind, this was an expensive venture, and he didn't want people running off with it. So that's probably the reason why he did it. Not because, but we oftentimes think that the reason is because he didn't want the people to have it. He just wanted it to be in church. But he did say that. It was only to be read in church. And the Latin version was not to be read, but this was to be read. That way, you've got the English translation being read that it was approved by him, and other people are not going to interrupt the services reading their English. So that was his fix of the problem. Okay. So then you've got him dying. Henry VIII died. Now, Anne Boleyn finally gave him a male heir. His name was Edward. And he comes to the throne for a very short time. His name is Edward VI. He was 10 years old when he became king. And he only reigned for 5 years. And so he was engaged, so to speak. It was known that he was going to marry a lady named Gray, Jane Grey, I think it was. And so he was going to marry her, but he was only 15. He's not getting married yet. Okay? It would have looked bad in the eyes of the kingdom. Okay? So he had no heir when he died. He was a sickly boy. But in his place, a man named Thomas Cranmer was running things for him in his stead because he was just a kid, you know. So he was running things. Now, Thomas Cranmer is a very big deal when it comes to Protestantism and when it comes to kicking the Catholic Church out. He was very, he aided money-wise the translation work and the printing of English Bibles. So from Henry VIII, who was against Tyndale, in a very, very short period of time, now all of a sudden English Bibles are approved, and not only that, now Cranmer is giving money, government money, to have those Bibles printed. Okay? So it turned really quickly into the favor of English Bibles. Edward VI rather dies. Just before he died, he named Lady Grey the queen. The people didn't like that, and she was ousted 9 days later. She's only queen 9 days. In fact, if you was to go and look at the lineage of kings and queens, she's not even listed, okay? Because she was really not supposed to be queen, okay? But they got to looking and trying to figure out who's supposed to be the monarch now. Guess who was next in the throne? Mary from over in Spain, because she was the daughter of Catherine, the first wife of Henry VIII. So she came to the throne. This is the devil trying to fight back. Okay? In the midst of all these great things that God's doing, there's going to be some battles. There's going to be some fights. Yes. So Mary comes to the throne, and she is known, otherwise known as Bloody Mary. Okay? Why? Because she killed tons and tons and tons of people. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who, at one time, she claimed that she was going to try to end the conflict between Catholicism and the Protestantism, and she was going to try to end that by having a conference and everybody get together and talk out their differences and come to a compromise. It was a trick. All those people, those Protestants that came, she arrested them and murdered them. Even the Pope didn't like her because she was so bad. I mean, really, when it came down to it, it's almost like she actually turned a lot of heads even further against the Pope because of how bad she was. I mean, the whole kingdom didn't like her. Another thing that she did, there is this deep animosity between England and Spain at this time. Well, she came from Spain. She actually married the King of Spain. Now, if the wife of the king of Spain is in charge of your country, who's in charge of your country?
Right.
Right? So that was a bad move on her part politically because people just did not like that. Now, turns out that when she died, trying to look at the dates here, in 1558, and Philip died only a couple of weeks later. Now, nobody knows why, but I seem to see a controversy there. I mean, why did they die? I don't know that was necessarily of natural causes. Okay, so that's how bad and the people hated her. People just hated her. Okay, so then a lot of people during her reign fled England. Here for the last 40, 50 years, they've had freedom. Right? They've been given a taste of freedom, and now the Catholic Church comes rushing back in, taking everything back over, and killing anybody that has the freedom to have the English Bible. So they've run. Okay, and among these were John Knox, William Whittingham. They go to Geneva. These are big name people in the Puritan movement. Okay, they get out there and they start and they do what's called the Geneva Bible a little bit later on. But now, what happens after Mary? The leadership changes again to Anne Boleyn's daughter, who was Elizabeth I, and she is now considered to be the most loved of all the monarchs. Everybody loves Elizabeth, okay, in England. Why? Because she kicked the Catholics back out, right? Mary was in there killing everybody, and she came into power and kicked the Catholics back out. Okay, 2 English Bibles were produced during her reign. The Bishop's Bible and the Geneva Bible. Now, the Geneva Bible was not done in England, but it was brought into England after she took power. Okay, she got rid of the Catholic Church, and then during her reign, a war took place between England and Spain. Now, remember, Spain had a rich navy, had a power. They were the superpower of the world at the time, but England had built up its power since the Catholic Church got kicked out. Okay, so they went to war, and guess who won? England. Spain was so tore down, it never had a prominence again after that. Okay, Spain was so pushed down that in 1600, it looked as though they were going early on. It looked as though where did Columbus come from? Spain.
Yeah.
Early on, the New World was going to be colonized by Spain. I mean, this was supposed to be a Spanish country, right? Colony, giant Spanish colony. Well, they were so decimated, they couldn't afford to continue their efforts toward colonizing the New World, so they leave. In 1600, they pretty much leave the New World. I mean, there's still people here that speak Spanish, obviously, that end up in Mexico mostly. But you've got Spain goes back. I mean, they get back. They get pushed back, leaving the New World open for the next superpower, England.
Yes.
Okay, so that's part of the history of that. But then the Geneva Bible is a work of Knox and John Calvin and Miles Coverdale. Miles Coverdale, who was he? He was Tyndale's assistant. So Tyndale is all the way through this. Okay, his work is all the way through this. And one of the sheets that you got was a list of verses that show a clear distinction between Geneva or Tyndale, Geneva, and King James, and how they're almost exactly the same. I mean, there is an 80 or so percent similarity between Tyndale's work and the final King James work. I mean, it's almost dead on.
Yes.
Okay, so it's just about it was mostly just about the work that Tyndale didn't end up completing. Okay, but he would have if he'd had time. The Geneva Bible was the Bible that was brought over to America on the Mayflower. You say, well, doesn't that mean we should be using the Geneva Bible? Well, to begin with, it's almost the same thing as the King James. But no, we shouldn't, and here's the reason why. The Geneva Bible was a very loved translation, and it was very popular for a long, long time. And actually, when the King James Bible was translated, it took 30, 40 years before it took over as the most prominent one. Well, the Geneva Bible was translated when the English language was still just not quite at that precise point. King James came in when it was. The Geneva Bible had study notes. Now, these study notes were done by one of the people whose name is John Calvin. So guess what? All the study notes were Calvinistic. Okay? And not only that, they were very bad political things. They would name names. They would say, instead of saying the Antichrist is going to be sometime in the future, they'd say the Antichrist is the king. Or the Antichrist is this pope over here, this guy named Gregory. In the study notes, right? So it was a very, very bad study notes. It was very bad study notes. None of the kings liked it. Elizabeth didn't like them. A lot of the people didn't like the study notes, and King James hated the study notes. Primarily, King James didn't like the fact that they were against the majesty, plurality of majesty. That the king was in just as important as a god in that country almost. He felt like it was important, but they were trying to go against Rome, against rule, against monarchy rule. But then so that's the reason why Elizabeth in 1568, Elizabeth allowed and approved the translation of what's called the Bishop's Bible. Now the Bishop's Bible is called that primarily because her Archbishop of Canterbury was named Matthew Parker, and him and a group of bishops got together and sat down and did the translation work. So now they're bishops of the Church of England, which has still got a lot of Catholic undertones in it. Even today it does. Okay, but regardless, they were still focusing on the ceremony and the ritual and all of that stuff. Okay, and so the Bishop's translation is not very good. It's not Tyndale's work. In fact, the Bishop's translation is looked at by most biblical scholars today as the worst ancient biblical translation ever done. It was just not a good translation at all. Okay, but it was being used by the clergy. Okay, so it was being read in the churches. It was being used by the clergy of the church. But then the Puritans, who were allowed to live in England now, they came back up. A lot of them came back over from Geneva and were living in England, and they were spreading their doctrine. They were very, very, to an extreme, they were very harsh, very, very strict. I would call them Pharisees, to be honest. Now, we look at the Puritans, we think of the Pilgrims, and they came over and they're such a great people, they were Pilgrims, yeah. But you know what? Here's the thing. They were Puritans. The Pilgrims were Puritans. Yes. And you say, well, what's the difference between Pilgrim and Puritan? Well, the way to look at that is, all Pilgrims were Puritans. But all Puritans weren't Pilgrims. A pilgrim just simply means he's a stranger in a strange land, right? So the Pilgrims were people, the Puritans that came over to America, but not all the Puritans came over to America. Right. Okay? But they were Puritans. And when I say Puritans, they didn't come over here for religious liberty for everyone. They came over here for religious liberty of themselves.
Yes.
Right. Okay? And if you look at some of the Baptist history, which, Baptist churches and Baptist people who preach in Baptist doctrine, they were killed by Puritans.
Yes.
Okay? That's how bad they were. They were so nitpicky that they were against all forms of jewelry. No wedding rings. If you wore a wedding ring, you were that was a damnable heresy in their eyes. Okay? But when King James was the king. He was James the Sixth of Scotland. When he became king in England after Elizabeth, he was King James the First, and he was 1603 to 1625. He was a very, very intelligent man. He knew very, very many languages. We hear a lot of bad things about King James. In fact, there's a big deal about him being a homosexual that people try to propagate. But when you really look at the information that we have about that, remember that the king had landlords, right? People who were in charge of these certain areas. Well, two of them guys were against Scottish people. I forget their names right off the top of my head. But those men literally said that Scottish people were like dogs, and they should be kept in a kennel. They spoke very badly about Scott. Well, King James was Scottish. Yes. So when he became king, he kicked them out of their landlord position, okay, and put somebody else. Those were the two men that wrote after King James was dead that he was a homosexual. So nobody really believed it back then. The only time it really ever became popular was in the 1930s or so, when the new translations started being popular, and people wanted to say King James was a homosexual. Look, don't read that one, read this one. Just because it had his name on it. But it only had his name on it because he authorized the work. Something interesting to point out real quick, and I'll finish, is that the King James translation, when King James got it ready, he gave certain rules. One of the rules were he wanted the translators to use the Bishop's Bible whenever possible. Well, they tried, but they soon found out that it was impossible. So you know what they used? The Geneva Bible. They went by it predominantly. Now they used a lot of other sources in Hebrew and Greek and everything, but here's the reason why those verses are the same, so close to the same. They looked at the Geneva Bible and they said, okay, here's what it says, here's what the Greek says. Well, they got it right, so we're going to do the same thing. Here's what this says, and here's what the Greek says. They got it right. So they didn't have a reason to change much. They did change some things, but not much. Okay? But today, when you look at, people say, oh, yeah, it's been translated and changed and changed and changed, but if you'll notice from Tyndale to King James, it's pretty close to the same thing. But why is it so close to the same thing? Because they could. Today, if you try to make a new translation, it's got to be different. Or it's not a new translation.
Right.
You're not going to sell any, you're not going to make a King James Bible with just a few words changed and sell it, because I've already got a King James Bible. I want to buy that one. Right? So as a result, as a whole, just think about this. From this short period of time, in less than 90 years, we went from English translations being damnable heresies by pain of death to a leadership change, a language change, and a religious change, to a power change. I mean, the British Empire started right then. Okay? Now, people talk about the Roman Empire, but the British Empire was much vastly bigger than the Roman Empire. I mean, the British Empire, they went to Hong Kong, went to the New World, they were all of Africa and India, and I mean, they were gigantic. Okay? So the British Empire was huge. And God used all of those things to open the door for the English translation of the Bible that then had the availability to be spread all over the world by way of the British Empire. And now even the English language is the number one second language in the world. In fact, languages are changing now to the extent that we're losing, out of all the thousands of different possible languages out there, many of them are disappearing completely in regards to English. Okay? Eventually, I think this. As we're in the days of Noah, well, in the days of Noah, there was only one language.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think sooner or later, it's going to be just one language.
Yes.
And if I have my guess, it's going to be English.
Yes.
All right, that finishes that. I know I went just a little bit over time here. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask now, or if you want to, just ask me later. All right,
Would you expound a little bit on the care that they took in translating
Sure.
from the original languages?
Now, a lot of that, what you're talking about there, is the Masoretes. The Masoretes, now that comes into play from copying scriptures from one copy to the other. And the Masoretes we look at them as far as the Old Testament scriptures because they copied thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of copies of the Old Testament. And they went to such extent that they would do things like if they came to the word for God, when they were making a copy, they would lay down their pen and they would go and wash their whole body. They would put oil on certain places of their body, and then they would come back before they wrote the word for God. That's how much they thought of the scriptures and how particular that they were. They would then, after they made that copy, they would do certain checks. They would count all the words to make sure that the words for the original were the same number as the words for the copy. They would count they would find the very center of that and make sure the center word was the same center word on their copy. And if any of that stuff didn't work out, they would throw their copy away and start all over. After hours and hours of work copying, if it didn't match the other one, they throw it away, dispose of it, burn it. So that's how particular they were. Now the King James translators were very, very particular about their work too, and really mainly because the King James, set this up. They were at Oxford and at Cambridge and different locations and broke up into different groups, and this group would translate this portion of the scriptures and this group would translate that portion, and then after they were finished they would send it to this group and they would double check it, and if they had any issues they'd go back. I mean, this went on and on and on. It was by committee. It was only the second book that was done by a committee. The Bishop's Bible was done by a committee, but it wasn't good. But King James Bible was done by a committee instead of by one individual or people that were running from the Catholic Church. Right? This was an authorized, not only authorized, but it was put together by the king, organized by the king to do it a certain way, so that they would be under these restrictions to make sure that they did it right. And so every single one of the translators, now of course the king was in charge of this, and they were allowed to do this in England, but the Catholic Church was still trying to stop them.
Yes.
The Catholic Church even tried to stop King James, tried to kill him. We know that as this man named can't remember his name, but he was a Catholic priest, and he was found underneath Parliament with dynamite stuff about to blow up Parliament because the king was going to be there, called the Gunpowder Plot. Okay, and so they tried to kill the king along with the translators, and some of them they caught, and I don't think they actually killed any of them, but they arrested them and held them for a long time, and they got sick and died as a result a lot of times. But so it was a scary thing to put your name on this, even then.
Yes.
Because remember, it's not even been 90 years.
Yes.
So, any other questions? Thank y'all for listening. I'm sorry it took a little longer.